Hey guys, and welcome to my temple. In this exciting visual effects tutorial... Well, since we're already at it, let's keep destroying stuff in Adobe After Effects and Cinema 4D. This is the second part of my tutorial on how to use Cinema 4D and Adobe After Effects to create a cool looking 3D destruction effect and composite it realistically into a moving live action shot. In part 1, we learned how to use the 3D camera tracker in Adobe After Effects to extract the movement of our camera from our real life shot and export all of that data ready for Cinema 4D. In this part, we're going to bring the tracking data into Cinema 4D and set up our scene and create a really cool looking 3D wall destruction effect and then render everything out ready to be composited in Adobe After Effects. This is going to be an intermediate tutorial, and I will obviously assume that you have watched part 1 of this series and that you have used Cinema 4D before, at least at a basic level, but I will go through everything in quite a bit of detail, so you should be able to follow along. But now, enough talking, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome to Cinema 4D, and let's start out by opening up the project file that we exported at the end of the last part of this tutorial. Here it is, tutorial.c4d, and if you don't have this file and you do want to follow along, I'm going to put a download link to this file in the description of the video. Let's hit open and check this out, and this should look pretty familiar. These are all of the elements that we've tracked into our scene in Adobe After Effects. If I come into my object tree and expand this, you will see there is a ground plane that we've tracked, the wall, the impact point, which is just a null. We also have this little smash text, which we won't really be keeping, but it's nice to have for reference. And if I scrub through this, you can see that the camera moves in sync with how it moved in our original shot. To make sure that all of this came across properly into Cinema 4D, I first want to set up an animated background for my viewport with the original clip in it, so we can make sure that everything is lined up properly and it'll track nicely. In order to do that, let's come up into the toolbar and let's create a new background element. So here's our background. And now we just need to assign an animated texture to this background that contains the frames from our original clip. In order to do that, let's come down into the material panel. Let's create a new material. Here it is. And let's actually call this one background. Over on the right hand side in the material properties, let's click on this texture tab. And let's navigate to the location where we have an image sequence of the original clip. So this is the original clip that you would have gotten as part of the first part of this tutorial. And I've just exported this as an image sequence. So it's just a bunch of JPEGs. So I'm going to select the very first one in the sequence and hit open. This is going to say, do I want to copy this image to the current location? No, I don't, because I actually want to keep the full sequence. So say no to that. So here is the very first image. And now I can again just kind of click into this. And in this image sequence, over on the right hand side, you will find an animation tab, and it's quite important. Go into that and then come down to the bottom, and here will tell you the start and end frame for your sequence. And right now it's 0 to 0, so that's incorrect. So let's hit calculate at the bottom. And there you go. Frame 0 to 313 is all 12 seconds of animation for our clip. So that's now correctly animating. And I also like to change the timing from exact second over to exact frame, so that every frame in your timeline within Cinema 4D will map to exactly one frame of your image sequence. Just feels a little bit more precise that way. And now the last thing we need to do, just take your background material, which we've created, and just drag and drop it onto your background object. Plop. There you go. So now you have the background. Let's scrub through this. And this should now properly track into the shot, and all of the elements should stay in place. So you see the wall is nicely tracked, the ground is nicely tracked, and you've got this smash text sitting right there. So everything seems to be set up properly. Next, it's a little bit weird that the ground in our Cinema 4D scene kind of goes through the middle of our original shot rather than being aligned to the ground. And because we're going to deal with physics, we also need to make sure that the scale of all our objects is correct relative to all of the elements in our actual footage. In order to look around our scene in the tree view, find your 3D camera tracker and make sure you disable this little icon here that locks your view to the camera so we can move around freely without making any changes. Let's zoom out a little bit. You can see all of the elements. Here's the camera, the ground, and everything else. And what I might do is I might temporarily disable the background because it is a little bit distracting. So let me quickly just disable that so it's a bit easier to see our actual scene. But you can see that the ground plane cuts through the middle here, and obviously we need to make sure that these ones are actually the correct size relative to the scale of our footage. So what I'm going to do for that, I'm going to wrap everything I have here in a new null object. So come up into the object panel. Let's create a new null object. Let's call this one root, and let's drag the 3D Destruction AEP-tutorial, the whole piece that we've exported from After Effects, under that root. And now we can move this root around, and we will not be affecting the way the camera moves relative to all of the pieces we've tracked into our shot. So the first thing with the root element selected I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this up so that my ground plane that I've tracked into my shot is actually on the ground plane. So it's about, that looks about right. That's not too bad. That's kind of just about on the ground. And because we're dealing with physics, I want to make sure that my scene has the correct scale. For example, I know that the distance from this smash to the ground should probably be about a meter and a little bit. And I can use the grid as guides to figure out the current distance and then scale my root object up or down to match that scene scale. For that, let's change the view over, for example, to the left view. Let's zoom out a little bit, and here's my ground, and there's my smash, and I can see how many grids are in the middle. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and a bit. And if you don't know how large these grids are, you can actually come up in your viewport under Options, go to Configure, and then make sure you're on the back tab. And down here you can see the spacing. So grid spacing is 100 centimeters. So each of these is a meter. So this is now 5.5 meters up. It's a little bit too big. So I'm just going to select my root object, come over into the coordinates, and let's just scale this down to, well, probably about 20% of it. So 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. So now we've scaled all of this down, and let's move this root object down as well, so that again, the ground and the text are about the same. Let's zoom in a little bit more. And now you will see that the text is about a meter and a bit from the ground, so this looks much more correct in terms of relative size. If you do find that the physics look a little strange and that the pieces are moving either too quickly or too slowly, you may want to adjust your scene scale to better match the look you're going for, but I will leave it at that for now. Let's return to our perspective view, and that actually looks alright. The last thing I want to do, just because I'm a bit picky, is that everything's kind of a bit skewed off, so it's a weird angle. So I'm actually going to again make sure that your root is selected. And let's just rotate this around just so that everything is a little bit more aligned with what we expect it to be. So our ground plane is nice and flat. I'll just make it easier to place the wall and kind of cleanly align all of that. So that looks all right for our setup. Finally, let's just make sure we haven't kind of screwed up anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-enable my backdrop, expand my 3D Destruction AEP object, and let's re-enable the 3D camera. And let's scrub through this. Yeah, cool, that all looks fine. We're now properly set up, the ground matches the ground, the scale is correct, and we're ready to set up the wall and destroy some stuff. Let's disable our camera view again so we can move around the scene, and again, let's disable the background so it's not cluttering up our viewport. So that all looks pretty good. So now the first thing I want to do is I want to create a ground plane, because otherwise all of the objects we're going to create are just going to drop down into nothingness. So let me collapse all of this so it stays nice and neat. Let's come up into the object menu and let's create a plane. Let's call this one ground. And let's just scale this up to quite a large plane so that it'll cover all of the elements that are going to destroy and fly all over the place. So that looks alright. The other thing I want to do is I'm standing approximately here and hitting through this smash text through this null object here. But behind me is a building, so I want to place a box here that kind of represents that building, so any elements that fly into that wall are kind of just going to bounce off. So in order to do that, let's create a simple cube. Let's call this one building. And let's just move this behind here. Remember, this is the wall itself. And let's also just scale this up so that there's essentially a wall behind me. We will have to line this up with the building itself, obviously, but this kind of looks alright for now. One thing I can do to kind of see how this will align is let's disable the ground for now. Let's re-enable the background. And let's again return to our 3D camera so we can see how this aligns. You can see the building here. So let's just kind of inch this into place so that this cube is kind of sitting right there and it's kind of right where that building should be. So that looks okay. So let's disable the camera again, disable the background so it's not in the way, and that should be alright. Let's re-enable the ground just so we can see it. Now, I know this is quite rough. We could obviously model this out a little bit more detailed and kind of add the opening and add the rocks in the front and whatever other geometry you had in your actual shot, but for the sake of this tutorial, I reckon this should do. Next, because we want the building and the ground to interact with the physics element in our scene, we need to give them physics tags, and unfortunately this is where you won't be able to follow along with Cinema 4D Lite, because Cinema 4D Lite does not support physics tags. But what we're going to do, I'm going to create a new null object, so let's create a new null, and I'm going to call this static geometry. Under this static geometry, I'm going to drop the building and the ground, and I can add other things into here that I want to be just static elements in my scene. And on this static geometry, I'm going to right click, come up into simulation tags, and I'm going to add this collider body. So this is just a physics tag saying anything that sits under this null will be just a static collider, a static object. And one of the things I need to do is with this tag selected at the bottom in the tags, I need to make sure that under collision, inherit tag is set to apply tag to children. So this tag is now going to essentially apply to the ground and the building. And now if we scrub through, well, absolutely nothing happens because we haven't actually created the wall and we haven't destroyed it yet. So let's start setting up the wall itself. Again, I'm going to just create a simple cube. Let's call this one wall. And let's kind of move it into place exactly where we want it to be. First, I'm just going to scale it down a little bit because I want it to be fairly thin. And let's just move it up a little bit. It's probably a bit too tall, to be honest. Let's just scale it down just a little bit. And let's just kind of nudge it into place. And I kind of want to stand it right where this text is. So I kind of want to stand it right where this smash text is, because that's exactly the spot where I'm essentially going to smash through the wall. And let's just scale it up a little bit more. So kind of standing right there, and I'll be standing back here, smashing through this wall. I'm also going to disable this smash text. So this smash text element, I'm actually just going to disable rendering and showing it in the viewport, because we now have the wall standing right in that place. And now the last thing we need is we need something to smash through the wall. And for that, I'm going to use a simple sphere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up into the Objects tab. Let's create a simple sphere. Let's rename it to something suitable. Maybe we'll call it Sphere of Doom. And let's scale this down quite small. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to place it where I'm standing. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit and kind of place it right here, right at the point where we want to smash through the wall, which is right there, if you remember, is where I want the sphere to essentially smash through the wall and break everything apart, and it'll hopefully match up with me smashing through the wall. But actually I can see the null object right here. That's the one we want to hit, because that is the point of impact. So right there is where I want to smash through that wall. Actually, I feel the wall could probably be a tiny bit taller now. So let's reselect the wall. Let me just scale the wall up a tad more. I just want it a little bit taller, and then move it into place. Cool, so let's move the sphere back. And now I want to animate this sphere to hit through the wall in sync with when I'm actually smashing through it. In order to do that, I need to animate the keyframes of the sphere in sync with the background animation so that it smashes through this wall right at the moment when I perform my punch. First off though, because the sphere is just going to be a collider body, I'm also going to drop it into static geometry. And yes, I know this isn't technically static, but it'll behave just like a normal collider that will animate. And I will also disable the rendering of our static geometry in my viewport. And so now I just have the wall. So let's return to the camera view. So let's look through our camera. So there's our big wall. And let me also re-enable the backdrop so we can kind of see that. Scrubbing through this is going to be a little bit hard to line up because I can't actually see the backdrop. What I can do, let's reselect the wall, come up into basic, and let's turn on X-ray mode so that we can kind of see through this wall. And what I might have to do just temporarily, I'm going to move this Sphere of Doom out of static geometry as well, just so that we can actually see it again. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to see it. So let's move through this, and there comes the punch. And right here is when we want this sphere to punch through the wall. Actually, I'm going to move it down a little bit. I think just because our scale isn't 100% off, that null object is not 100% telling me where I'm smashing through the wall. That actually looks all right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move the sphere backwards to about there. So remember, it sits behind the wall. If I disable the camera and kind of come around, you can see the sphere sits behind the wall on this particular frame. So let's come back a few, and you can kind of see in the background, this is where I'm starting to swing. So let's make sure we select the Sphere of Doom, and let's set a keyframe. Let's move forward. 1, 2, 3 is when I'm punching through. Let's go 2, 3 more frames forward, and let's push the sphere through this wall to the other side and quite a bit of distance through the other side, so it punches through with quite a bit of force. And let's set another keyframe and let's rewind and just check that the sphere right here is when it punches through the wall. So I think this is actually quite well aligned. So that's where the sphere punches through the wall. That looks quite all right. Let's drop the sphere of doom back into the static geometry because again, we have it animated now. We should no longer have to see it. And let's also return to the camera view to just check this out. And let's scrub through this. Cool, so right there, the sphere is going to punch through the wall and hopefully everything is going to fall apart and crumble. So that looks cool. Next, let's come back. And we now need to destroy this wall. Right now, if we were to include this wall in the physics simulation and play this through, this would just be one chunk. So this whole chunk would just topple over or kind of fly away as the sphere hits it. That's not what we want. We need to break this wall into a whole bunch of little pieces so that it can fragment and shatter and then kind of spill all over the place. The easiest way that I have found in Cinema 4D to break geometry is actually using a third-party plugin, but fortunately this one is absolutely free. So come over into your favorite browser and simply come up to https://nitro4d.com product Thrausi, that's T-H-R-A-U-S-I. I'm not sure why it's called that, so it's called Thrausi. And this is a free plugin that will allow you to break up objects. And you can just simply select your Cinema 4D version and select your type, and then you can just simply download it and install it for free. Doesn't cost you a dime. So back in Cinema 4D, I obviously already have it installed. The plugin itself is super easy to use. Simply make sure that you have the geometry that you want to break selected. I'm actually going to collapse my other null objects just to keep it nice and clean. So select the object you want to break, which is our wall. Come up into Plugins, Thrausi, and then select Thrausi. This will bring up a little pop-up and you can just determine how many pieces do you want to break this into. Now, rather than breaking this wall into a bazillion little fragmentary pieces, I'm first going to break it up into a few larger chunks so that I can make the chunks on the bottom kind of stay in place and then break a few of the larger chunks into smaller chunks and just look a little bit more natural and just introduce more smaller pieces at the point of impact, and then the rest will be just a little bit larger and hopefully it'll just make the whole thing look a little bit more realistic. So let's say I'm going to break the first wall down into 20 pieces. I'm going to select Voronoi, and you can kind of change these options as you want. Don't need to do anything specific. And I do want to keep my original wall. I'm just going to hit break now. And Thrausi is going to go off and break all of this into little chunks. Cool. So now my wall is broken up into pieces. Let's close down Thrausi for the moment and have a look at what happened. So here is my original wall. It's now hidden. And Thrausi has replaced it with 20 little pieces. So these are 20 pieces. Let me make sure I don't have my camera active so that I can kind of move around. So here are now 20 pieces. Again, let me disable the background just so it's a bit easier to see. We have now broken this wall up into 20 little pieces. So now if we scrub through, it'll simply collapse and fall over because they're not waiting with the physics until they're being hit. They're kind of just falling over. So at the very top, can kind of come up to Thrausi because Thrausi has already added a physics tab automatically to this because it assumes that if you're breaking stuff, you probably want to apply physics. So let's select the physics tag on the wall Thrausi object and let's come into dynamics and make sure you change the trigger from immediate over to on collision. So this should only trigger once the sphere hits them. So if we now scrub through, there, right there is when the sphere actually hits through. What I might do is I might actually re-enable the visibility on the static geometry for now as well, just so we can actually see what's going on. So there's the sphere, and if we scrub through this, you'll see the sphere will come through and kind of punch through the wall. Right now the chunks are way too big, it kind of looks really weird. So what I want to do is, for one, I'm going to select a few pieces at the bottom of this wall and kind of make them static so they don't fly away. So I'm going to kind of come in here. I'm going to select a few of these bottom pieces. So that one, these ones. Let's select a few of them, probably not too many, maybe about there. So everything above this can then break and shatter and fall apart. So maybe these ones here. And with these pieces selected, let's open up the Thrausi. So these are the pieces that I have selected. And I'm going to drag these pieces out of the parent object and just drop them next to the wall Thrausi object. So these are the pieces that I don't want to be affected by the sphere. And let's create a new null object. And let's call this one wall bottom. So these are kind of the bottom pieces of the wall and drop all of the pieces into that. And what I'm going to do here, because I still want them to be part of this physics simulation, I just won't want them to move. I'm going to right click, go to simulation tags and apply a collider body. So they're physics objects, but they're not actually going to move about. They're going to stay static. So again, at the beginning. Let's just play this through. Cool, so now the sphere really only affects the top pieces, but again, they're still way too large. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start picking some of these ones and breaking them up further. So let's select a few of these pieces here at the top, and quite honestly, maybe some of these ones over on the right-hand side as well. I kind of want them to shatter a little bit more. Let's come back up into the plugins, Throwsy. Select Throwsy, let's bring this up. And let's maybe break each of these ones down into, maybe let's go with another 15 for now. Again, it's up to what you want to do. Let's select Voronoi. This time I don't actually need to keep the original object. I just want to shatter these ones further. So let's just go break. And Throwsy will do its thing and go through and break them all up. Cool, so now our wall is a whole lot finer. Let's again rewind a little bit and play this back. Cool, that looks quite good, but you may notice that we've got some floating pieces here, which that was kind of a bit strange. Because physics simulations running in a computer program are only ever approximations of the real thing, there are a few difficulties and challenges in getting them to be really accurate. Things that you may notice is like floating objects, because it didn't detect that there was an actual collision and that their physics state has changed. Or other issues you may see is that pieces on the ground may never fully come to rest. They kind of keep moving and jittering and jiggling or bouncing around weirdly. And it has to do with the accuracy of the actual simulation. To resolve some of these problems, let's rewind our timeline and come up into Edit, Project Settings, and let's come into the Dynamics tab. And under Dynamics, let's go into the Expert tab. And in here, you can change some of the settings on how the physics solver, the physics simulation, is actually going to be applied. Things that you can do to make this look a little bit better and work a bit better is A, we can increase the steps per frame. So this is the physics calculation steps that are going to be applied at every single frame in your timeline. The higher you bring this up, the more accurate your physics simulation will be, but obviously it'll also be a bit slower. Maximum solver iterations per step is, well, how for each of these steps, how many iterations the solver should go through. Again, it's just an accuracy thing. Maybe I'll jack this up to, let's say, 20. And the error threshold defines at which points in these iterations the solver will stop. So let's bring this down to maybe 3%. So again, make sure we're at the beginning and let's play this back and see what happens. Cool, that looks a whole lot better. We still have this one floating piece. One thing we can do as well, in the physics tag on the wall Throwsy object, let's come into the dynamics and let's set the trigger velocity threshold to 0. This threshold defines how much collision velocity is required to activate the physics on each of these wall fragments. And we want that to be nice and low, so let's rewind and play this back. Cool, and now all of the pieces drop. That actually looks a whole lot better. Sweet, so this is starting to look quite nice. One of the things I want to do is that at the point of punching through for the sphere right here, I think I want to break a few of these pieces just a little bit more so that there's just a few more fragments just where the sphere or where my fist is going to be punching through the wall. So let's rewind. And again, we're just going to do the same process. Let's just select a few of these pieces here. Just kind of break them up a little bit more just so that there's a bit more variance in the pieces that are coming out of this wall. So once again, come up to Plugins, Throwsy, let's bring this up, and maybe we'll break these ones into, doesn't have to be too much, maybe I'll go with another 15. Voronoi, we don't need to keep the original objects because we just want to shatter this whole thing. Let's go break. Cool, that looks good. And again, you can kind of go in and break these ones further if you want to. I think for the sake of this tutorial, that'll probably do. Let's just play this back. Nice, and that actually looks pretty cool. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that we can't really scrub through this. We always need to play this back from the very beginning. And that is because the physics simulation needs to be calculated from the first frame through. But what we can do is we can essentially bake this physics animation in so that, you know, Cinema 4D will cache it and we can just kind of scrub through and deal with all of the individual pieces. In order to do that, let's come up into Edit, Project Settings, come into Dynamics, and under Dynamics, you'll find a cache, and this is really useful. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure I'm at frame 0. I'm just going to hit Bake. This is going to bake my physics simulation, so it's going to calculate the physics and essentially keyframe the animation onto the objects involved in the simulation. And now make sure you use cache data flag is set. And now you should be able to simply scrub through the whole thing and back and forth and just kind of check this out and see what this looks like. And cool, so this is now the actual wall destruction effect. Let's return to our camera view and let's get rid of all of the static geometry from our viewport and let's bring in the backdrop again. So let's rewind and let's just play this back and check this out. Cool, and there you go. That's the basic of 3D destruction, and you can really apply this to anything that you want. Obviously, there's still tons of things that we can do to make this effect look a little bit better, like we could break the wall a bit more interestingly, deal with friction and kind of make a lot of little refinements, but because this tutorial is starting to get a little bit long, I'd rather move on and talk about how to render all of this out properly so that we can then composite it in Adobe After Effects. For that, let's do a quick test render. And you can see that for one, I can still see the tracking planes in the background. I can also see the backdrop itself. So let's, in our root, disable rendering. So when we render this out, this won't be visible. And on our backdrop, let's do the same thing. Let's just say don't render it. It's fine to see it in the viewport. So now if we do a test render, all we get is the wall itself, and let's assign a texture to it. For that, you can use any material that you want. I'm simply going to use a preset to keep it nice and short for this tutorial. And I'm a little bit out of the screen, you can't really see this. I'm just going to select a concrete material. Let's go with concrete 6. And let's assign that to the Throusy wall. So at the very top level, let's assign this, let's render it out. And the texture doesn't get applied to the children. If I expand this, you'll see that all of the children have this default texture assigned. So what I want to do is I essentially want to kind of select all of these. So hold down Shift and select them all. So all of these default materials I want to actually delete. I'm also going to delete these duplicated default materials because we don't want those ones either. And now all of them will simply receive the material from the parent, and that is that concrete material that we've assigned. So if I now render this out, cool, the pieces now have some texture. However, our wall bottom does not yet have this texture, so let's assign this texture to the wall bottom as well. And if we expand this, same thing, let's just delete the default materials on the children. So that looks better. Let's render this out. And there you go, your wall now has a texture. However, you will notice that the shadows are still quite harsh and the pieces themselves don't actually cast any shadows. Now, we did film this on an overcast day, so there are no actual harsh shadows. If you filmed this on a sunny day, or maybe there's lights in your scene, you would then have to set up actual lights in your Cinema 4D scene to simulate and kind of fake those out. But for this tutorial, we're not going to go into that. Maybe I'll make another tutorial for that at some later point. For now, we're just going to kind of render this out and then use some ambient occlusion just to kind of add a bit of shadowing where the elements are overlapping. To render this out, let's come up into the project settings. In your output tab, make sure that your width and height are set correctly. Mine is set to 1080p, so it's 1920 by 1080. Frame range is set to all frames, which is correct for our final render, but while we're testing this, I'm going to change this over to current frame, so I'm not rendering every single frame. Under Save, let's come in here. Let's change the format over to OpenEXR. OpenEXR is pretty great. If you haven't used it, I might talk about that a little bit later. Let's select a file path where we want to output all of this to. Let's just create a new 3D folder. Let's go in here. Let's call this beauty pass. So this is now going to save out to a beauty pass image sequence essentially out of EXRs. I also want to render out the alpha channel so we get transparency and we can then overlay this wall onto our actual shot in After Effects. The other thing I want to do as well, because I'm smashing through the wall with some force, I want the pieces flying away to have some motion blur. In order to add that, come down into Effect, and let's add, you can't see it, at the bottom, there's a vector motion blur option, so I'm going to add vector motion blur. So let's make sure that's added and ticked, so we're now going to render this out with motion blur. Let's close this down. Let's go to a frame where I'm smashing through the wall, so maybe about here. And let's simply click on this middle icon to do a simple, small test render. This has now rendered out our wall, but we don't actually see any motion blur, and that is because, again, Cinema 4D needs tags to tell it which elements to apply the motion blur to. So let's close this down, and I only need the motion blur on all of the loose wall pieces that are flying away. So again, under wall Throusy, let's right-click this, go into Cinema 4D tags, and there should be a motion blur tag. So let's pick that and apply it. And in here you can change the strength. I'm just going to leave it at 100%. Let's re-render that in the picture viewer. Yes, I want to replace this. So now you can see it's calculating the vector motion blur, and we should see that in a minute. There you go. So now you have the wall destruction effect with motion blur. The other thing I want to render out as well, which is always really useful for compositing, is a Z-depth pass, which is a grayscale image that shows you the distance of the elements from the camera. And you can easily use that then to place 2D elements in your scene and kind of blend them in with all of these pieces and with the destruction. And we're going to do that with smoke and fire and a few other elements, so we definitely need to render out a Z-depth pass. In order to do that, let's close this down. Let's disable our camera view so we can kind of see the camera from the top. And let me just quickly hide the background again, because it's a bit harder to see. With the camera selected, come over into the details. And we need to enable the depth of field front and rear blur, because these are the two planes that are going to be used for calculating the Z depth. So enable those two planes, and you're going to see there's going to be two planes added, one for the front and one for the back. And you can adjust the distances here. So let's kind of tweak them so that we can see all of the elements as they're coming close to the camera. Let's make it a bit closer. So this is my near plane, and the far plane should encapsulate everything up until the very last piece of the wall. Yep, cool. So that should be set up. Let's return to the camera view. Let's come up into the render settings, and the Z depth pass is created in a separate render pass, so we will need to use the multipass option. First off though, we need to add it, so come down to multipass and click on that. And here I want to select my depth. Again, it's outside of my recording area. At the bottom there's a depth pass, so let's add the depth pass. So now we have the depth pass added. Let's make sure we enable the overall multipass option. Let's make sure that in save, there's now a multipass. Let's make sure we're also saving this image. So again, let's change the format over to OpenEXR. And let's again pick the same path, but this time I'm going to call it multipass. So any multipass we render out will be called multipass, followed by the name of the actual pass. So we will end up with a multipass depth image sequence at the end. Let's close this. And let's again go to a frame where we should see some motion blur right here. And let's render that out in our picture viewer. So here's the actual image. If we now come over into layers and let's move over into single pass. So here's the actual beauty pass. We have one layer for the alpha. So this is going to be baked into with the beauty pass. And then we have a layer for the depth. So this is the Z depth map. As I said, it's just a grayscale image, and everything that is dark is close to the camera and everything that is white is far away. So you can kind of use this to then composite nicely in After Effects, and I'll show you how to use that in the next part of this tutorial. So everything is now being rendered out properly. Let's come up into our render settings. Under the output settings, let's change the frame range back to all frames. So we are now ready to render this out. Close this down. And then you can render this out either in the picture viewer or you can add it to your rendering queue. So if I just go onto the picture viewer, this is now going to start rendering out the entire wall break animation. And this will now render out all of the frames for the wall destruction effect, so we can composite it in Adobe After Effects. But because this will take a little while, I'm going to cut this off here and just let it render out onto my hard drive in spare time. Instead, I want to show you how to render out your ambient occlusion pass, because that is the third pass that we're going to use and need to composite this into our live action shot. So now we've rendered out our beauty pass, which is just the default pretty image, as well as the depth pass onto the hard drive. The last thing I want to do is I want to render out a shadowing pass. And for that, I'm going to just use ambient occlusion. You could set up lights and render out an actual shadow pass, but because everything in our shot was really diffused, there wasn't really any harsh shadowing. So I think we can get away just with using ambient occlusion. And in order to do that, let's come up into the render settings. We can now disable the multi-pass. We will no longer need this, and we no longer need the depth pass, but we can just leave that hanging here. Instead, I'm going to add another effect, and the effect I'm going to add is ambient occlusion. So let's add ambient occlusion into the mix. In my Save tab, I'm now going to change this to be my AO pass, so my ambient occlusion pass. I'm going to render this out with the same settings. Also, while I'm testing this, again, I'm going to come into my output and change my frame range over to my current frame. So we can now render a single frame. Let's do a quick test render by pressing Ctrl R. This is just going to render just my normal wall, but I'm not actually seeing much ambient occlusion. And what I want to do is I want to essentially assign a flat white material to all of these pieces so that all I see is the ambient occlusion, black on white, so that I can then composite it in Adobe After Effects. The easiest way for that, let's just create a new material. Let's disable specular, let's enable luminance, and we'll get a flat white material. And I'm going to essentially override my wall texture. So I'm going to drag this material onto my wall, and I'm also going to put it onto the wall bottom. So now we're just going to render this flat white. And if I now render this out, all you can see is just these little pieces of ambient occlusion. Now, this frame is probably not a good example. Let me find a nicer one, maybe right here where I'm cracking through the wall. Yep, let's render this out. Yeah, there you go. See, there you can see the ambient occlusion just between the pieces where, they're very close to each other. And this is going to give us some nice shadowing once we composite this. So I think I'm actually pretty happy with this setup. Let's just come back into our render settings, In our output, let's change this back over to all frames. So now all of these frames, all of these ambient occlusion frames are going to be saved as our ambient occlusion pass. Let's close this down. And again, let's just render this out either in your render queue or just in the picture viewer. And again, I'm just going to let this render out. Here I have some that I've prepared earlier. So once you're done rendering, you should have 3 image sequences, one with your beauty pass, one with your depth pass. Well, here I called it depth pass. I think I called it multi-pass in the other one. So you should have a depth pass. And then you'll have a shadow pass or an AO pass, like an ambient occlusion pass. So these are the 3 image sequences that we've rendered out. And in the next part of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to take all of these elements and composite them back into your live action shot to finish the wall destruction effect. And that is how you create a 3D destruction effect in Cinema 4D. In the next part, we're going to take all of the layers we rendered out and bring them into Adobe After Effects to composite them into our live action shot. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, if you do have any comments, questions or suggestions, just leave them down in the section below. If you did enjoy it, please show your support by liking, favoriting and sharing it, and don't forget to subscribe if you do want to see more cool filmmaking and visual effects tutorials. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.